Tell Adrian you misunderstood what you saw.
What happened?
It wasn't me, she was right here.
Preserve the security footage. Daniel, get down here.
This proves nothing.
Why does the missing footage matter?
Because by morning, this becomes my word against hers.
Preserve everything. What did you find?
Tell Adrian you misunderstood what you saw, and nobody has to lose anything tonight. Vivian spoke quietly, almost kindly, while Camille stood beside the pantry door with a gray folder open at her feet, and 17 years of professional instinct telling her not to move. 3 invoices lay across the marble between them, each carrying a different vendor name, although Camille had already discovered that 2 shared a mailing address, and all 3 led back toward the same financial network. She had photographed the records 3 days earlier, after a document she questioned vanished from the household server and returned with altered service descriptions. Now the security camera above the service corridor had stopped blinking, and Vivian had looked toward its dark lens twice since their argument began. Camille did not know who had disabled it, but she knew exactly what the absence of a recording could become by morning. When footsteps sounded behind Vivian, Camille expected Daniel from estate management, yet Adrian appeared instead, home nearly 2 hours earlier than anyone expected. He stopped when he saw them, his overcoat still damp from the November rain, and Camille watched his attention move from Vivian's rigid posture to the invoices scattered across the floor. Adrian had spent the evening at an investor dinner downtown, which had ended early after one of the partners received a family emergency call, and he had returned expecting an empty kitchen and a quiet apartment. Vivian recovered first, explaining that Camille had accessed financial documents outside her responsibilities and become confrontational after being questioned. Adrian listened without interrupting, then turned toward Camille and asked what had happened. Camille could feel her pulse beating against her throat, but she had learned years ago that fear became dangerous when other people were allowed to interpret it for you. "Before I answer," she said, "ask Daniel to preserve tonight's security footage." Vivian's face barely changed, although her eyes went once more toward the camera. Daniel arrived carrying the estate tablet and opened the security dashboard, while Adrian remained between the 2 women, without deliberately taking either side. The camera covering the service hallway had stopped recording at 11:36 p.m., and unlike a hardware failure, the interruption appeared to have been initiated through administrator access. Daniel checked the other cameras and found them functioning normally, then told Adrian 5 people possessed credentials capable of reaching the system. Vivian asked whether they were seriously turning a disagreement over bookkeeping into a criminal investigation, and Adrian told her nobody had used the word criminal. Camille watched Daniel export the logs, knowing the distinction might disappear quickly if the evidence did. When Adrian asked why the missing footage mattered, she pointed toward the papers without touching them. Because whatever happened here tonight is about to become my word against hers, and somebody created 17 minutes when there would be no picture. Vivian said Camille was manufacturing suspicion to distract from the fact that she had copied confidential records, and this time Adrian looked directly at Camille. She admitted taking photographs before he could ask, explaining that the copies contained invoices she had been assigned to reconcile while Vivian's assistant was out sick. Adrian's expression tightened because unauthorized transfers violated household and company policy, and Camille did not attempt to soften that fact. Instead, she asked him to read the invoice closest to him, CHP 4418, issued by Crestline Event Partners for a foundation reception held 6 weeks earlier. The bill included staging, floral installation, and guest logistics totaling $68,400, although Camille had personally signed delivery logs showing separate vendors performing much of the same work. Vivian said event accounting involved reimbursements Camille did not understand. Camille looked at her and asked why North Vale Floral, which had billed another reception for overlapping services, used the same White Plains suite as Crestline. For the first time, Vivian did not answer immediately, and Adrian noticed because hesitation was unusual in a woman who could walk into a board dinner, knowing nobody, and leave remembering every name. She finally said affiliated vendors sometimes shared administrative offices, then accused Camille of treating ordinary accounting irregularities like evidence, because she wanted leverage after being corrected at work. Camille almost responded, but Daniel interrupted from the tablet and said the security interruption had ended automatically at 11:53, 5 minutes before Adrian entered the hallway. Someone had not simply turned off a camera and forgotten about it. The system had been given a limited window and then restored itself. Vivian demanded to know whether the logs identified the device, but Daniel said deeper forensic work would be required because the administrator credentials were shared. Camille heard something change in Vivian's breathing, subtle enough that Adrian might have missed it. Then Adrian asked the question Camille had been waiting for since the folder first hit the floor. What happened during those 17 minutes? Camille looked at Vivian before answering, because there was still one detail she had not revealed, and she wanted to know whether Vivian understood that. At 11:41, 5 minutes after the camera disappeared, Camille had heard Vivian make a phone call from the kitchen while believing Camille was locked outside the service entrance waiting for Daniel. Camille had returned through the laundry corridor instead and heard only the final sentence before Vivian noticed her. She had not recognized the person on the other end, and she had no recording that could prove the conversation existed. What she remembered was Vivian saying, "You were supposed to remove the old files, not create another problem." Camille told Adrian exactly that and nothing more. Vivian stared at her across the marble floor, and for the first time that night, fear reached her face before she could hide it. Daniel isolated the Penthouse network before anyone touched another administrative control, while Adrian asked Vivian and Camille to remain in separate rooms until the digital logs and documents could be preserved. Vivian objected to being treated like a suspect inside the home where she was supposed to marry Adrian in 4 months, then stopped when Adrian reminded her that Camille had already admitted conduct that could cost her job. Camille heard the exchange from the breakfast room and understood what Adrian was attempting, although equal scrutiny did little to make their positions equal. Vivian could leave the penthouse, call counsel, and wake the next morning financially secure. Camille could lose her income, references, health insurance, and professional reputation before anyone determined whether the invoices were legitimate. She did not resent Adrian for failing to solve that imbalance in one night, but she needed him to recognize that procedure alone could not erase it. When Daniel returned with document sleeves, Camille helped identify each invoice and then stepped away. Adrian asked how a housekeeper had noticed financial discrepancies that had apparently escaped people paid to review them, and Camille told him the question contained its own mistaken assumption. Before joining his household 14 months earlier, she had spent 6 years at a luxury hotel, beginning in guest services and eventually becoming assistant operations manager with responsibility for vendors, staffing, and event reconciliation. She left after reporting altered overtime entries that deprived hourly employees of pay. The hotel corrected the payroll, thanked her publicly, and quietly stopped considering her for advancement. After months of interviews that went nowhere, she took private household work because it paid reliably while her mother recovered from surgery and because she needed a year without fighting an institution. Adrian listened without interrupting, embarrassed by how easily he had mistaken someone's current position for the boundaries of her experience. Camille did not make the embarrassment easier for him because she was tired of powerful people turning their discovery of another person's complexity into evidence of their own growth. The invoices began troubling her 3 months earlier when Vivian asked her to help reconcile receipts after a foundation dinner because her assistant had pneumonia and several vendors were demanding payment. Camille found overlapping services, inconsistent delivery records, and companies whose public registrations led toward Hale family entities, although nothing initially proved fraud. She questioned Vivian once, received an explanation about internal reimbursements, and continued the work because incomplete accounting was not evidence of wrongdoing. 2 weeks later, however, a vendor file Camille had flagged disappeared from the shared folder and returned with a revised description that resolved the exact discrepancy she had mentioned. That frightened her enough to begin keeping handwritten dates, but not enough to copy documents until access permissions changed after another question. "That's when you should have come to me," Adrian said, sounding more disappointed than angry. Camille nodded because he was right, then told him being right about that did not mean she had been wrong to fear what might happen next. Near 3 in the morning, Daniel found something that complicated the situation before anyone could settle into a convenient theory. The camera shutdown had used legitimate administrator credentials through remote access, meaning the person controlling the session did not need to be physically inside the penthouse. Vivian immediately said that eliminated any implication she had disabled the recording during the confrontation, and Camille agreed, surprising her. Adrian asked whether Camille was withdrawing her suspicion. "I'm saying the log proves less than we wanted it to," she answered, because she had no interest in making evidence carry more weight merely because it favored her. Daniel added that several authorized devices had connected remotely during the previous 6 months, including temporary credentials created for foundation events. He could identify the device only after forensic specialists reconstructed older access records. Adrian authorized the review and instructed Daniel to preserve everything without attempting to trace it himself. The next morning, Vivian arrived at Adrian's study, carrying a printed cloud access report obtained from the household IT administrator before Adrian suspended internal access. She placed it on the desk and asked Camille to explain 23 photographs uploaded to a personal storage account, including invoices and 2 internal email chains. Camille admitted the transfer and said she knew it violated policy, although she had preserved the records after seeing files disappear and permissions change. Vivian's voice rose for the first time when she asked why anyone should trust a person who secretly removed confidential material from an employer's home. Camille started to answer, then stopped because anger would only turn the conversation into competing performances of innocence. "You shouldn't excuse what I did," she said to Adrian. "But don't let my mistake answer questions it cannot answer." Vivian stared at her, then asked whether Camille wanted special rules because she had less money and less influence. Camille shook her head, feeling months of restraint finally strain under the accusation. "No, Vivian, I want the same facts to keep their actual size." Her voice cracked slightly, and she let it because pretending perfect control had become another kind of dishonesty. "I copied records I should have brought to Adrian first, and I may lose my job for that. But I did not invent those invoices, change those files, or make that phone call." Vivian opened her mouth, then looked away when Camille mentioned the call. Adrian noticed. He also noticed that Camille's hands were shaking, despite how carefully she kept them folded. Before anyone spoke again, Vivian's phone lit on the desk with a message preview from a name Adrian knew immediately. Miles. Vivian turned the phone face down, but the movement came too late, because Adrian had already seen her brother's name and the first words of the message. "We need to talk before they pull the old access list." Adrian asked what Miles knew about the household system, and Vivian answered that he had helped coordinate 2 foundation events at the Penthouse earlier that year. She insisted the message probably referred to vendor folders rather than cameras, although the distinction sounded less convincing after Daniel confirmed temporary remote credentials had been issued during those events. Adrian asked Vivian to call Miles on speaker, but she refused, saying nobody should interrogate her brother without counsel after the situation had become a formal investigation. That was a reasonable position, which made Adrian more uneasy rather than less. He had spent enough time in business disputes to know reasonable decisions could protect innocent people, guilty people, and frightened people with equal efficiency. Outside counsel took control before noon and removed Adrian from fact-finding because the dispute involved his fiancée, his residence, and employees paid through Cole Executive Services. The company issued a narrow statement acknowledging an independent review of financial conduct and unauthorized handling of records without assigning conclusions to either allegation. Camille read it from Rachel Mendoza's office near Bryant Park, where she had gone after a former hotel colleague recommended the employment attorney. The language was legally clean and emotionally devastating, because strangers reading it could easily imagine 2 employees accusing each other of comparable misconduct rather than a household worker questioning someone who controlled her assignments and access. Rachel told her the statement was not fatal and advised her not to fight a public relations battle before the evidence existed. Camille understood the advice, yet understanding did not make the words feel less like an institution sanding every difference smooth. Adrian called shortly afterward, and Camille listened while he explained why counsel believed neutrality protected the integrity of the review. Halfway through, she realized he was speaking more carefully than he had ever spoken to her, which meant lawyers were already standing invisibly inside the conversation. She told him she was resigning because remaining financially dependent on Cole while challenging conduct inside Adrian's household would contaminate every decision she made. Adrian asked her not to decide from anger, and Camille surprised herself by laughing once, because anger was the least dangerous thing she felt. "I'm scared," she said, abandoning the composed language she had relied upon since the first invoice. "I have enough savings for maybe 5 months, and I don't know whether another hotel will touch me after this. But staying, because losing the paycheck scares me, would make every future question easier to silence." The confession changed something in Adrian because Camille had finally stopped sounding like the most prepared person in every room. He told her he could place her on paid administrative leave without requiring her to withdraw any allegation, but she declined after asking whether the money would still come from a company whose executive household she was challenging. Neither had a perfect answer, and Camille was relieved when Adrian did not manufacture one. Before ending the call, he apologized for something smaller than the scandal but more personal. He had employed her for 14 months without ever asking what work she had done before his home. Camille closed her eyes and told him that was not the apology he needed to concentrate on. "Fix the system that made it safer for me to copy a file than report what was inside it," she said. Then she ended the call before either of them could turn the moment into intimacy. Rachel brought in forensic accountant Derek Shaw, who began by challenging Camille's assumptions rather than validating them. He traced Crestline, North Vale, and Hawthorne through corporate registrations, banking references available to investigators, and event records obtained through counsel. The companies were connected indirectly to financial entities associated with Miles, whose hospitality investment had collapsed 4 months earlier under creditor claims and unpaid taxes. That timeline made Vivian's involvement more plausible, but Derek warned Camille that financial pressure did not prove who authorized improper payments. More importantly, cloud metadata established that Camille's photographs existed 3 days before the confrontation, undermining any later claim that she fabricated records after being threatened. Her policy violation remained intact, but its chronology now mattered. Across town, Adrian confronted Vivian about Miles after independent counsel confirmed investigators were examining Hale-connected vendors. Vivian initially refused to discuss her brother, then admitted she had been helping him after his business collapse threatened both his finances and 14 months of sobriety. She used her own money first, sold investments next, and eventually redirected temporary event reimbursements through vendors she believed she could repay before annual reconciliation. Adrian asked whether charitable or coal-linked money had covered Miles's private obligations, and Vivian looked toward the window before answering, "For a while." He felt grief before anger because he recognized the woman who had funded scholarships, sat beside frightened hospital families without photographers, and spent years doing genuine good. Vivian saw that recognition and whispered, "Please don't make the worst thing I've done become the only true thing about me." Adrian answered quietly, "Then don't ask me to make the good things erase it." Vivian sat down as though the strength had gone from her legs and told Adrian the first redirected payment had been intended as a bridge lasting less than 3 weeks. Miles faced an immediate creditor action, and she convinced herself moving money between event accounts was different from taking it because she had enough personal assets to replace everything eventually. Then another payment came due, followed by taxes and a lawsuit, while each hidden transfer made correcting the previous one more dangerous. She admitted restricting Camille's access after the questions began because she feared incomplete records would be interpreted before she could restore the money. Adrian asked whether that was why she confronted Camille, and Vivian nodded, tears gathering without becoming the absolution she seemed to want. When he asked about the phone call during the missing footage, however, she went silent. "You said somebody was supposed to remove old files," Adrian reminded her, and Vivian rubbed both palms over her face before answering. She had called Miles after discovering Camille possessed the gray folder because Miles had previously offered to clean outdated vendor material from shared event directories. Vivian insisted she had never asked him to touch security cameras and had not known they were offline during the confrontation. Adrian believed part of the answer because it fit facts they already possessed, yet another part remained wrong in a way he could not identify. He asked why she had looked repeatedly toward the dark camera if she did not know it had stopped recording. Vivian stared at him for several seconds, then said she noticed the missing light only after Camille did. Adrian remembered Camille never mentioning the dark lens until after his arrival, and he understood that Vivian had just given him an answer, containing information he had not supplied. He did not accuse her, because independent counsel had ordered him away from the investigation, and for once he understood restraint as responsibility, rather than neutrality. Instead, he left the apartment and sent counsel a factual account of the conversation, including the discrepancy about when Vivian noticed the camera. He also authorized structural changes at Cole Executive Services that no longer required employees in executive homes to report concerns through people socially or romantically connected to the executive. The reforms would not help Camille retroactively, and Adrian refused the temptation to tell her about them as evidence that he had learned something. He had begun to understand how often apology became another transaction when powerful people expected the injured person to witness their improvement. Whatever changed at Cole would have to matter even if Camille never returned. Meanwhile, Camille's savings were disappearing faster than she had admitted to Adrian, and Rachel's reduced fees did not make rent, insurance, or groceries disappear with them. One evening, after a hotel rejected her application following a background search that surfaced the investigation, Camille sat in her apartment staring at the rejection email until humiliation finally broke through the discipline she had carried for weeks. She called her former colleague Leah and said perhaps she had made the wrong choice, because being principled felt considerably less impressive when nobody wanted to employ the principled person. Leah did not give her an inspirational speech. She asked whether Camille regretted finding the invoices or only regretted the price. Camille cried then, quietly and angrily, because the distinction was cruel and useful. The next morning, she applied to 3 more hotels and told Rachel she wanted the investigation finished, even if no employer ever called. The forensic report arrived 2 days later and identified the device responsible for the missing 17 minutes as a tablet registered to Miles. Rachel immediately warned Camille that ownership did not establish intention, and at the closing fact-finding session, Miles confirmed why. He had remotely entered the Penthouse system that night after Vivian called, intending to remove old vendor documents before Camille could copy additional files. Miles said he entered through an administrative dashboard he had used during foundation events and mistakenly disabled the service corridor camera while changing permissions. The recording resumed automatically when the session expired, explaining the precise 17-minute window without requiring anyone to program it. Vivian's attorney asked whether Vivian instructed him to disable surveillance, and Miles answered no. For one uncomfortable moment, the central mystery resolved into something messier than conspiracy. Deliberate destruction of records had collided with an accidental camera interruption. Rachel waited before asking the more important question. Did Vivian know you had entered the system? Miles glanced toward his sister and admitted telling her before sunrise that he had accessed the dashboard and probably interrupted a camera. Vivian closed her eyes because the admission exposed not the original accident, but the choice she made afterward. Rachel displayed an unsent email draft recovered during authorized forensic review, written to Vivian's attorney 6 hours after the confrontation. Vivian had typed, "If Camille admits taking confidential files, we may not need to explain what happened while the camera was down." No dramatic confession followed, and nobody needed one. Camille looked across the table at Vivian, remembering how frightened she herself had been that night. "I believe you were scared," she said. Vivian swallowed and nodded. Camille continued, her voice unsteady but clear. "I was scared too, Vivian, and that's where our choices stopped being the same." Derek presented the financial findings after a recess, tracing several reimbursements through event vendors linked indirectly to Miles's failed venture, and showing that Vivian had personally approved transfers she knew were unrelated to their stated services. Her private records supported one part of her explanation because she had scheduled asset sales intended to replace much of the money, which weakened any simplistic theory that she planned to steal permanently. They also established that she knowingly concealed the transactions, changed access after Camille raised questions, and allowed accounting records to misrepresent where funds had gone. Investigators recommended regulatory referral, repayment, and separate employment findings, while Miles faced consequences for unauthorized system access and attempts to remove vendor records. Camille's cloud transfer received its own finding. She had violated data policy, but investigators found no evidence of fabrication, personal gain, or disclosure beyond her attorney and retained expert. The distinction did not make her conduct proper. It made the consequences proportional to what she had actually done. Outside the conference room, Adrian approached Camille and stopped far enough away that she could decide whether the conversation happened. She was exhausted, relieved, and unexpectedly sad because Vivian had become neither the monster required for easy hatred nor the misunderstood benefactor required for forgiveness. Adrian told Camille he had spent weeks believing fairness required him to withhold judgment until every fact carried equal certainty. She shook her head, not wanting another polished lesson after a day already crowded with lawyers. "You don't have to explain it perfectly," she said. Adrian looked embarrassed, then nodded and tried again. "I should have understood sooner that waiting costs different people different things." Camille accepted that sentence because it sounded like something a man had learned rather than something a writer had prepared for him. The following months contained consequences without spectacle. Vivian resigned from leadership at the Hale Foundation, repaid the diverted funds after selling personal investments, and accepted civil penalties that made future fiduciary work unlikely for years. She entered counseling with Miles, whose recovery had become another casualty of the secrecy supposedly designed to protect it, although neither sibling disappeared into ruin. Adrian ended the engagement privately before the regulatory process concluded, telling Vivian he could understand why she became frightened without trusting the choices fear had taught her to justify. Cole Hospitality separated executive household employment from personal chains of authority, created an external reporting office, and required independent review whenever senior leaders or their families appeared in employee complaints. None of those reforms carried Camille's name. When the investigation closed, Cole offered Camille a senior compliance role through Human Resources, with a salary large enough to solve nearly every financial problem the previous months had created. She considered it seriously rather than rejecting it for dramatic effect, because rent had taught her that dignity and money were not enemies. In the end, she declined because returning immediately would force her to spend years wondering whether every promotion reflected competence or Adrian's need to repair the past. Adrian did not call to change her mind. Instead, the company reimbursed only the portion of her legal expenses allowed under its findings, processed her final employment record accurately, and let the decision remain hers. The absence of a grand rescue felt strangely respectful. Northbridge Luxury Hotels called 3 weeks later, after Camille's fourth application to the company, and the interview panel did not pretend the investigation was irrelevant. They asked why she had copied records, what she would do differently now, and whether she could enforce a data policy she herself had violated. Camille answered that she would use formal escalation channels first, then admitted her former workplace had lacked an independent channel when the conflict began. One executive challenged her sharply, asking whether she tended to justify rule-breaking whenever she believed herself morally correct. Camille felt the old defensive answer rising and chose a harder one. "No, I learned that good motives don't make bad controls safe, including mine." They hired her as a regional operations advisor, not an ethics executive, and made her prove the rest. The work was less glamorous than the title sounded, involving understaffed properties, supervisors who avoided written complaints, and employees who had learned to say everything was fine whenever management entered the room. Camille spent months rebuilding reporting procedures while resisting the seductive belief that being personally trustworthy could substitute for a system people could use without her. She made mistakes, including one rollout that overwhelmed night shift supervisors with paperwork and another policy employees quietly ignored until she asked why. Each failure forced her to listen rather than defend the intention behind it, a lesson she recognized with uncomfortable familiarity. 11 months later, unresolved grievances had fallen sharply across her region. Employee retention had improved, and 2 expensive vendor problems were caught before becoming scandals. Northbridge promoted her only after the numbers supported what colleagues had already begun to see. 16 months after the night the camera went dark, Camille stood outside a new training center at Northbridge, while workers peeled protective paper from lettering across a glass door. The Camille Brooks Service Leadership Lab had not been her idea, and she agreed to the name only after the company committed funding to confidential reporting, paid management training, and advancement tracks for frontline employees. She had no interest in becoming a symbol displayed where a functioning system should have been. During the opening session, she spoke to housekeepers, department heads, union representatives, and young supervisors about the ordinary moments when organizations taught employees whether truth was welcome or merely tolerated. She never mentioned Vivian by name. The story no longer needed a villain to explain what the lesson had cost. A young housekeeping supervisor asked what managers should do when an employee breaks policy while exposing a larger problem, and Camille paused because 16 months earlier, she would have answered too quickly. She said managers had to investigate both facts, without using one as permission to erase the other, then determine consequences based on intent, harm, authority, and available alternatives. The answer was less elegant than the speeches people sometimes quoted from her industry interviews, but it was closer to what she actually believed. When the session ended, Camille saw Adrian standing near the back wall among representatives from several hotel groups. Cole Hospitality had joined Northbridge's external reporting consortium, but Adrian had not funded the lab and had not asked to speak. He waited until everyone else who wanted Camille's attention had received it. "Congratulations," he said when she finally approached. And for a moment, they were both awkward enough that Camille almost laughed. Adrian looked different without being transformed, his confidence still present, but no longer filling every silence before somebody else had the chance. He told her the independent reporting office at Cole had received 43 concerns during its first year, most involving ordinary scheduling, payroll, or supervisor disputes that were resolved before anyone needed to risk a career. Camille said that sounded useful, and Adrian seemed relieved she had not interpreted the information as a request for praise. He started to say something about the past, stopped, and rubbed the edge of his thumb against his coffee cup. "I had a better sentence prepared," he admitted. "I'm trying not to use it," Camille smiled then, because the imperfect admission sounded more human than anything he might have rehearsed. Adrian said he had wanted to apologize again, but he no longer knew whether repeated apologies helped the person receiving them or merely reassured the person giving them. Camille told him the first apology had mattered and the reforms mattered more, which was enough for both of them. He asked whether she ever regretted leaving Cole, and she considered the question rather than offering the triumphant answer her younger self might have preferred. There had been nights when she regretted losing the paycheck, mornings when she hated Vivian, afternoons when she blamed Adrian, and weeks when she blamed herself for not reporting sooner. "I regret parts of how I handled it," she said. "I don't regret refusing to pretend I hadn't seen it." They walked toward the lobby together, where late afternoon light stretched across the polished floor, and employees hurried between conference rooms without noticing either of them. Camille remembered believing that strength meant needing nobody, because dependence had once seemed like the doorway through which other people acquired power over her. Rachel had taught her that asking for expertise was not surrender, while Derek had taught her that facts became stronger when somebody tried to disprove them. Adrian, less comfortably, had taught her that decent people could participate in unfair systems simply by waiting too long for certainty. None of those lessons made her invulnerable. They made her less interested in pretending vulnerability, and power could never occupy the same person. "I have 30 minutes before the next session," Camille said as they reached the center of the lobby, and Adrian waited because he had finally learned not to complete invitations that belonged to someone else. She nodded toward the cafe beside the windows and asked whether he wanted coffee, making the offer ordinary enough that neither of them had to decide what it promised beyond half an hour. Surprise crossed his face before he said yes. When he added that she could choose the place, Camille raised an eyebrow toward the cafe she had already selected, and Adrian laughed at himself before following her. They joined the line behind two housekeepers still wearing Northbridge uniforms, and nobody stepped aside for him. The barista accidentally handed Camille's coffee to Adrian, who checked the name, apologized, and passed it across without ceremony. She took it and looked back through the lobby toward the glass door carrying her name, remembering another doorway where she had once stood with invoices at her feet, while someone asked her to deny what she knew. The difference was not that she had become rich enough, important enough, or protected enough to guarantee nobody would ever try silencing her again. The difference was that she had built a life in which fear no longer got the final vote on what she was willing to say. Adrian opened the cafe door, then stepped aside without assuming which direction she would choose afterward. Camille walked through because she wanted to, carrying her own name, her own mistakes, and a future that no longer required anyone else to lose for her life to become whole.